Hello, Simone. Today's conversation is one I have been excitedly digging into. We are
Yes,
going
you
to
have.
discuss the history of the greater Appalachian cultural tradition or the backwoods cultural tradition in the United States. This is the tradition that you and I hail from predominantly. Like obviously, everyone's a mix of a number of traditions. They're also heavily from the Puritan tradition, and you're partially Jewish as well. But the main one is the greater Appalachian tradition. And the reason why it's important to understand this tradition is because this is the tradition that makes up the core of the MAGA movement and Trump's voter base and American sentiment shifting from the cavalier cultural tradition of the Deep South to the greater Appalachian cultural tradition, shifting from an aristocratic to an anti-aristocratic, anti-elitist tradition, represents a big change in American conservative politics. So there's a reason to understand it. But I'm going to be exploring it with the lens of its stereotype in 80s horror of like inbred backwoods murderers who are going to like hunt down people and murder them.
She's just human. Why don't you go over there and talk to her? Whatever you say, just smile and laugh. It shows confidence.
You guys, going camping?
Hey. Because as you will see, when we go into more about this tradition from their own stories, yeah, that may not have just been a negative stereotype.
Oh boy.
That reminds me where this first came up for me is I was having a laugh at the Mormons because, you know, in Utah, they had the highest rates of searches for polyamory on Google Trends. And then after having a laugh at them, I was like, well, I should at least check my own cultural group's negative stereotypes. You know, that's certainly not going to be a closet full of skeletons. And it's like 4 and S&M. And sorry, I can't forget incest as well. And all of the other like horrible.
Yeah, like it makes, polyamory, if anything, is just about social complication, hierarchy, bureaucracy, contract. Then they have like your culture, our culture, which is just savagery, animals.
Yeah. Okay, so first, I want to go into Jack stories as a sort of cultural explanation. So this culture passes its traditions down through oral stories, with the most common type of these stories being the Jack stories. Although after this, we're going to explore their horror stories as a way to understand them as well. You might be familiar with one Jack story, which is Jack and the Beanstalk, but it comes from like a wider tradition of stories. In Jack stories, there is generally a chain of events. A poor and lazy, but otherwise quick-witted boy stumbles upon either a giant or somebody with institutional power, like a rich man, or somebody who represents like government, like a sheriff. He then tricks or otherwise torments that person and has great glee at doing this. He then tricks and murders that person. He then takes all their stuff. You know, you're
Very aspirational, Malcolm.
Life is a rich person. I mean, this is fundamentally what happens in Jack and the Giant Beanstalk.
It is, yeah.
The, like,
it always kind of
sanitized
sat weirdly with me. It's one of those stories, though. I think there's a lot of stories that you get told as a kid where you don't really get the impression that there's a good guy or a bad guy. And I think this concept of good guys and bad guys needing to be pervasive in stories is, you know, unnecessary.
Well, you're clearly misunderstanding the cultural context.
Oh, because he's the good guy? He's the clear good guy here?
Unmitigatedly the hero. And he's not just the hero. These stories are told to teach children values, to teach children how they are supposed to interact with the world. You even commented on how the values of these stories you have heard me say to our kids in passing.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, one of Malcolm's constant rules was it's okay to punch anyone larger than you. You can never punch anyone who's weaker or smaller than you.
Yeah, and I told this to our kids, you know, like she knows this because like the kids are always allowed to punch their older siblings and me, but they are not allowed to aggressively punch younger siblings. And this is just part of this cultural tradition, right? Jack is always up against a giant or a very wealthy person or a sheriff. He represents small, diminutive underdogness. If I'm going to go over some, so like I mentioned Jack and the Giant Beanstalk. If you're not familiar with that story, he goes out, he goes to a market and buys beans, what are magic beans, with the cow that he's supposed to sell, instead of doing something diligent with it. So he's very intentionally not a diligent person.
I think you're supposed to
Not-
just sell the cow for money so the family could buy food. And what does he do? He buys magic beans.
And the mom gets mad and throws the beans in the yard, and they grow a giant beanstalk. And then Jack climbs up the beanstalk, and he finds a giant. Generally, in the original stories, the giant has done nothing wrong.
Minding his
Jack-
own business, just living up in the sky.
Jack then murders the giant by tricking him, and he takes the giant's, hen that can lay golden eggs and a few other items, and they live like wealthy people for the rest of their life. The value here is goof off, trick people more powerful than you outsiders, take their
Don't
money.
follow instructions, disregard your mother's orders.
If you go to Jack and the Giant's New Ground, Jack, from a poor mound family, seeks out to seek his fortune. He stumbled upon a giant's new ground, cleared land, and is captured. So essentially, he finds a giant's farmland and is captured. The giant plans to eat him, but Jack tricks him, pretending to be stronger, squeezing water from a rock, actually a wet sponge. Impressed, the giant spares Jack and gives him tasks. Jack outsmarts the giant in each, eventually stealing his treasure and killing him by luring him into a trap, e.g. a pit or collapsing brig. Jack home rich. But the point I'm making is, if you study these Jack tales from the perspective of the villains in this Appalachian horror arc, Jack is behaving in a way that aligns with these villains, right? He is, I remember I talked to an AI about this, and it was like, well, in Jack's not doing it maliciously. And I'm like, he may not think it's doing it maliciously, but from the giant's perspective, it's pretty effing malicious.
Pretty sure that trespassing and theft and murder are
In the one where he gets back at his stepmom, he gives her things that like make her fart uncontrollably, and he laughs at her. So it's often like tormenting people and laughing at them, which is what you see in these scary horror arcs. Is the people from the woods are like, oh, there's these out-of-towners that would, from their perspective, have institutional power over them, therefore justifying. Often, if you watch an arc like Deliverance or something, like they believe that they were slighted, that the out-of-towners thought they were better than them. And so then they use this as an excuse to say, well, now we can kill them and take their stuff. I mean, that's what always happens in the stories, right? And torment them while doing it.
Right.
And this form of sort of tormenting, like, to get an idea of how violent this culture was historically, we've talked before, a common practice in it was to file your nails down for a style of combat called rough and tumble, where the goal was to maximally disfigure your opponent, ideally gouging out their eyeballs. And this is like well documented that this was something that happened frequently, to accounts of bar floors covered in eyeballs after one particularly big fight. Very, very violent. If you look at our president that came from this, you're looking at like Andrew Jackson, who famously would just threaten anyone to duels, like over fairly trivial things.
Did he do that as president ever?
I think he
While in
did that to
office?
I think the Dickinson guy, he did that to while president. But
Charles Dickinson. Not to be friends with Charles Dickens, by the way.
in his defense, the other guy had called his wife a bigamist, which she technically was, but she didn't know.
Ugh.
Her other husband had not gotten their marriage properly annulled before her marriage to Jackson. And so he just ran him to a duel and shot him. But the point being is, it was a very violent cultural group to begin with. And I think that Jack tales are particularly interesting to study because they always start, with the hero being this kid in poverty who is otherwise lazy and wins through trickery and murder. And you don't see this. You see this in some other cultural traditions, but you're not going to have like a chain of Jewish stories about like how to be a good Jew, and the stories involve the Jew tricking and murdering somebody, right? Like you don't see like a chain of, I haven't heard of like a train of like Italian stories with similar themes or something like that. This is pretty unique to this cultural region. And the stories have to be pretty heavily sanitized to be retold in the modern context.
If you were hearing this and you were wondering, how is the Jack archetype different from a trickster god from other religions, because this is a common arc within cultures, is the concept of a trickster deity or god or something like that. He is different in many, many ways from any other trickster entity that exists. the most glaring is that he is always unmitigatedly the hero of the story and also cruel. If you look at other trickster entities like a Loki or something like that, or a coyote, they are morally ambiguous characters. They are not very obviously the hero and the core hero of every narrative that they're in. Later, we're going to point out that Bugs Bunny was likely inspired by the Jack archetype, given where Tex Avery grew up. And this gives you an example. Like, Bugs Bunny is cruel and capricious, but also always unmitigatedly the hero. The other thing that is, when you contrast it with other archetypes, even Loki, who is a bad guy within his own framing, is rarely as mean-spirited as the Jack archetype, where you have, like, Bugs Bunny is another good example of this. Loki is almost never as actually malicious as Bugs Bunny is within his own stories. The other thing about the Jack archetype is he has no supernatural powers, which is uncommon for the trickster archetype. He always is just purely operating off of what the subgenius would call slack.
For people of different cultural backgrounds, I actually think Bugs Bunny is a very easy way to understand Jack stories. If you're like, how could a character both be unmitigatedly the hero of a story, but also incredibly cruel, predominantly being cruel to others because he thinks it's hilarious? Bugs Bunny will explain that to you. Bugs Bunny is just one-for-one Jack archetype.
But it gets more interesting than that, because you also find a really interesting nature to the horror stories that come from this region. Any thoughts before I go further?
I just feel so ambivalent about it because it's not exactly pro-social behavior. You wouldn't
I-
really.
It,
I don't know. Like, will this
incredibly
encourage
vitalist.
societies to flourish when there's just this like free range on, or sorry, what is it? When it's open season on people who are seen as being more successful or resourced than you.
Yeah,
Is that-
well, I mean, these regions never did become very wealthy, historically speaking.
I mean,
There was a reason for that, a cultural reason, but they've been incredibly resistant to the urban monoculture, which is one reason why it's so important to study them. And within modern times, I mean, yes, they have a much higher murder rate than surrounding regions when you control for the presence of cities, but things are basically copacetic enough that you don't see this kind of regular murdering happen anymore. The more aggressive practices, they don't rip out eyeballs anymore. I've never done that personally. I was going over like wedding practices, and one of the wedding practices that they had is the women would take a cat and put it in the middle of like a quilt, and they all yank on the corner of the quilt to launch the cat up in the air. And then whoever the cat ran by when trying to escape is who was going to get married next.
oh, at least they didn't have to try to catch the cat.
Yeah.
Oh, that would end so badly.
They don't do that anymore, but they do still. I mentioned in the episode on dating culture within this region, value mates based on martial prowess and ability to protect property. If you go back to like David Bowie, there was, what am I thinking of? He was the congressman, right? I would get Daniel Boone, and he was talking about his wife, and about, somebody was commenting on like how good she was, and they're like, oh, she could protect the whole property with a rifle, she's such a good shot. And that this has been a historic thing. It's not just in modern times, like girls with guns is like a thing for this culture, or girls fighting is a thing for this culture. You have the modern mud wrestling of this culture, but people, even going back to Albion Seed, said that the women were uniquely valued for how rough and tumble they were, and their level of fortitude. So this is a big historic part of this culture, as well as gender egalitarian relationships, which is funny. A reporter was like, well, your relationship's uniquely gender egalitarian. Like, is that like not traditional? And I go, well, it's traditional for people where I'm from, because if you treat your wife too poorly, she'll just murder you. That's not something you do. But I want to go into horror stories from this region, because I think they also show.
So wait, the hero stories sound like horror stories. What is the difference?
Well, the difference is Jack's the good guy.
Oh, okay. So it's a horror story if our protagonist loses.
It's a horror. You'll get why the horror stories are horror stories.
Okay,
We'll
all
go
right.
into horror stories, and you'll be like, oh, those are horror stories. Okay. So to go to the horror stories, we'll start with the Witch of Booger Hole. In Clay County, West Virginia, a young bride, Ira, moves to Booger Hole, a dense forest. Locals warn of Grandma Thorn, a witch blamed for missing animals. Ira's skeptic husband dismisses it, but animals vanish, and Ira hears scratching in the night. Her dog is found dead, throat torn. Confronting the witch, Ira sees a crackling figure vanish. Some say Ira's husband dies and she flees. Other is just she's murdered. The next is the Bell Witch. In
I just have
Roberts
to note that, like, what was it, Booger Creek? That this was something that they pointed out in Albion Seed about backwoods naming conventions of areas, that they would be named things like,
that were gross and like low
yeah,
culture
like
intentionally.
Shit Valley, and like, under the, like, all sorts of very lewd names for things.
Well,
They
and
probably
these
can't
people see
say.
this. We've talked about how they see vulgarity as authenticating honesty and sort of like that you're not attempting to fit in with the elite, which is why
Mm.
they don't care about like the grab them in the pussy thing or like the other vulgar things that Trump does, because that's very much in their culture how you signal, I'm within the in group. Like, hey, let's hang out. I don't think I'm better than you. That is like the number one most important thing to this culture. And it's why Trump has done really well with him. And it's why old Republicans didn't do as well with him, because they acted like they thought they were better than them and were like trying to enforce cultural norms on them. And this group is very much, don't tell me what to do or how to live my life,
Mm.
above all else. They do have cultural pride and they do have a degree of cultural norm, but that norm is not pushed through shame or like, this is vulgar, don't do it, etc. So in Robertson County, Tennessee, the Bell family is fermented by a witch, possibly Cat Balls, wronged by John Ball. Starting with noises and animal disguises, it escalates into slapping, pinching, and poisoning. John, who dies, it taunts his daughter, Betsy, forcing her to break her engagement. The witch's cave remains haunted. The Witch of Polygentry. On Hawks Nest Mountain, West Virginia, Polygentry is a rumored witch, lives with a demonic black cat blamed for crop failures, missing children. She's confronted by men who find her cabin empty, the cat screeching, fleeing. They hear her laughter and see her shadow. And then there's Talipo, which is actually one I remember from my own childhood. And I've read to our kids because I got the book because I remembered it and I wanted to get it back. And I remember reading the book. I was like, whoa. So the guy just dies in the end. So a hunter shoots the tail off a strange creature and eats it. At night, it scratches his cabin, chanting, Talipo, Talipo, I want my Talipo. It returns to Nightly. First, it eats his dogs, by the way. Nightly finally breaking in to rip him apart. Then you have Rawhead and Bloody Bones. This is in Tennessee and North Carolina. Rawhead is a skinless, bloody creature with a skull-like head hiding in dark places. A hunter in Forbidden Hollows hears Rawhead and Bloody Bones is coming and is chased, his dog torn apart. This is linked to a witch's courage. You have, this is a Cherokee one, so we won't go that one. The point being with all of these traditions is that you might notice something really interesting about them for local horror stories,
Okay.
which is in none of them is the witch ever killed or faces any repercussions for her action.
Right. The malevolent thing remains at large.
The malevolent thing wins. In many ways, the victim of the story is made out to be the bad guy because they did something they were warned against. Like, don't F with that old woman. Don't, show her a lack of respect. Don't whatever. But they do. And then they are mercilessly, like their kids are tortured. They're tortured. Their animals are killed. Like it is bad. Okay. The second, which makes it really different if you do a cross-cultural analysis of these with other cultures, is the villain feels much more Lovecraftian in the way that there just is no escape from the quote unquote witch or Talipo or anything like that. Like the moment you are there, it is over. And there is no limitations on their powers. They are in many ways all powerful and totally evil. So if you contrast this with other traditions, in European stories, the witch, one, often dies at the end, consider like Hansel and Gretel or something like that, or is at least trickable. Like Baba Yaga is powerful, but Baba Yaga is trickable as well. She is operating on rules. If you go to like East Asian witches and stuff, they may win, but they have some restrictions. Like they have to hop, or they're only interested in like one particular thing. Like they don't have
Right.
a broad interest in just tormenting you, your animals, and your children to death. They're more like specifically interested in some domain or with some sort of violation. You look at African culture, and there's usually like a hex or something you could do to get out of it. An example of like a counter to this is the Des Omen and Token tradition. So in West Virginia and Kentucky, omens like 3 knots, white owls, or banshee-like walls predict death. A Harlan County woman hears a wail and sees a shadow. Her husband dies in a mine collapse.
Oh no.
Rituals fail to stop the omens. So there's like within these traditions, the moment you've seen the bad thing or you've done the bad thing, your fate is completely sealed. And blame is often shifted to the individual who's dying, much like, well, you just should have known not to mess with this person. Which is really fascinating to me when I contrast this with other traditions. I think one thing you also see with Jack Tales and these traditions is you can see how many tropes that arose in American media were influenced by these traditions more than like European traditions and stuff like that.
Oh, you think
Uh,
so?
yeah, so if you think about the classic Looney Tunes like cartoon character, your Bugs Bunny and stuff like that, Bugs Bunny is clearly modeled after Jack, for example.
You're
Uh,
right. Yeah, no, he's very irreverent, he's got a lot of slack if we were to use
and
the
keep in
Church
mind,
of the
he wrote
Subgenius to
these
describe him.
these were written by Tex Avery. Where did Tex Avery grow up? But Dallas, Texas, which is part of, if you look at maps of the regions where I grew up as well, part of the greater Appalachian cultural region. Even though it's not in the Appalachians, it was this culture that was,
Mm.
it was the dominant culture there. So he would have grown up on these stories and then adopted a character like, Jack into a character like Bugs Bunny, who is lazy but cunning and constantly tormenting people who he would see as coming after him, like hunters and stuff like that, right? Like people who enter his territory.
If you grew up with the character of Bugs Bunny, I think the character of Jack and the parts of him where I'm like, well, yes, the people who he murders often did something to warrant it, but he wouldn't care if they did something to warrant it. You would understand this attitude if you grew up watching Bugs Bunny. Bugs Bunny often torments people who are hunting him or something, but that isn't why he's tormenting them. It's just because they're in his territory or around him. He would think nothing about tormenting somebody who had done nothing to him.
Often doing things to them that would kill them in any other circumstance. And also note the sort of environment of Bugs Bunny, how it mirrors the environment that these people would have had, hunters, woods, rabbits, ducks,
Oh,
everything.
the scenarios. I don't know. I mean, there are also opera houses, but I generally see you here. And I mean, my theory is that this has to be a result of clan-based culture and trying to teach people that, like, no, actually, if you go to those people who we say are going to hurt you, you will die.
You will
There's
100%
no coming
die,
back
and it will
from
be
this.
your fault.
Right.
And this is also important with clan-based culture when you have things like blood feuds that can start. You need some way, and it's like, well, you shouldn't have talked with them. We told you they'd kill you.
Yeah. Because they really will. They hold
will
grudges.
kill you. Yes. Which I think is, you can see, and we make up stories even organically for our kids all the time that are meant to teach them things. Like, oh, they believe that we have witches that live, at the swamp by our house. And I'm like, oh, that's why witches live in swamps. I don't want my kids going in the swamp. That
Right.
makes
Yeah.
perfect sense,
I mean, I think a lot of that kind of overlaps with Grimm's fairy tales where, they were told in regions where if your kids go out at night, that they might actually be eaten by wolves. It made sense to warn them of monsters in the forest and stuff because there was stuff out there that would legit kill you. So we still do that with our own kids. We're like, yeah,
So I
there's
also
monsters
think
outside at night.
if you look at 80s horror movies or older horror genres in the United States, and you look at the ways that they are structured, the other interesting thing that comes from this cultural tradition is the villain that there is absolutely no way to escape, that you will eventually die, which is not seen in many other traditions. If we were basing these off of like European witches and stuff like that, you'd have much more of a, well, they're scary, but you can trick them. Like, here's what you do. And we do have some horror movies that are structured that way. But the horror movies that are influenced by this tradition are the ones where, no, you really like don't mess with it. Don't begin to mess with it. If you do, it's over for you.
Right.
Which is, it's pretty interesting to see that influence our culture. So I
Good
thought
point.
that was pretty cool.
The other thing I note about these stories is they are much like more existentially scary than even the raw, unedited for kids versions of the European stories, where it was like Baba Yaga, you'll have like a house with chicken legs and like a woman who conceptually is like cannibalistic or something, but otherwise it's an old woman. Whereas with like Bloody Bones, you have a person without skin coming to get you. That's just way more horrific.
Now, if you look at, I was looking at other traditions like Hansel and Gretel, comparing it to that, Baba Yaga, where you can trick them. Even the witch in Snow White, defeatable, right? Like not like these characters.
I feel like that in Snow White, it gets so muddled that there's a lot of the classic stories kind of end with this deus ex machina of some hero doing the thing, which I don't know. Those are uninspired. And these are more interesting in that the villains are just dangerous things that exist in the world, and you should know about them. I kind of like it more.
Well, no, I remember the Tally Post story stuck with me so much as a kid because it felt so different from other stories I had heard as a kid. It starts with the guy's dogs being killed, which I don't remember seeing in any other illustrated children's book that had ever been read to me. Like that as a kid, I remember was quite shocking. I was like, wait, his dog dies? And then I hadn't even remembered this until I read it as an adult. And I was like, oh, and he dies? It's very much framed as the world is closing in on this guy. The moment he makes a mistake, everything's over from that point on. And that was really shocking to me as a children's story. But I think it's an important value, and I can see why a culture like this would teach it. Now, we're going to talk about some other fun traditions from this region. One was wedding spoons, where guys couldn't afford rings. They would carve these really beautiful spoons to show off their carpentry skills.
This reminds me of the human version of what emperor penguins do. With emperor penguins, right, where they find a really, really pretty rock and they work really hard to get it, and then they give it to their chosen mate. And this idea of like working really hard to make a nice spoon is so romantic. And I looked up the spoons, and they're very impressive. I would be impressed.
You're like, dang, that's a nice spoon.
Yeah, I don't know how I would go about whittling
Spoon
that.
is
That would
good.
take and they're nice and polished, beautiful, intricate shapes, personalized to, in many cases, I imagine the aesthetics and interests and values of the recipient. Just beautiful,
Yeah.
really nice. I wonder if they were probably never used, but it'd be so cute if women, at a fancy dinner, would just pull it out and, my spoon. I don't know if
Yeah.
this was still in the age when you had to bring your own utensils to everything.
I think it was. This would have been I mean, these people didn't have much. A spoon was like a major thing to have in this period. In
Yeah,
other
I mean, I wonder
regions,
why they didn't do knives instead, because I feel like that would be the spoons do look a little bit delicate and precious, and a good knife would, probably last longer. But
yes. I mean,
whatever.
as an understanding of like being from this tradition, when I met Simone, one of the first things she did, like when courting me, was showing me her knife collection. That is from another culture that would be seen as incredibly dense for a woman to do, trying to get a guy to like her. Look at all
Dense?
the knives I have. Well, these are they're not like cooking knives. They're like big collection of like like pink and stuff like that, hunting knife. Like you were clearly like, these are girly, but what's conveyed
They're
by
all
that?
pink.
But I'm in a martial tradition, right? Like I am from and you told me you remember like growing up, your family would always say, well, Smiths do this and Smiths do that. Like
Yeah, Smiths have guns, Smiths have knives. Like that is what distinguished us. It wasn't some code of honor or anything. It was
But I
just
also
guns and
remember
knives.
my family talking about this a lot growing up. Is they'd always say,
Yeah.
well, Collinses do this and Collinses do that.
I
And I
love
think
that.
this is a normal thing for clan-based cultures. I think if you're from a non-clan-based culture, what you would say is Jews do this or Jews do that, or Mormons do this or Mormons do that. But the
Mhm.
central unit of identity is seen as the extended family network,
Yeah.
which is why your cultural values are framed to you along the lines of, well, you're a Collins, so you do X, or you're a Smith, so you do X. Like that's
I
just
think it's more powerful because it creates a greater sense of personal responsibility. If
Mhm.
I, as a Mormon, were to behave irresponsibly, I mean, I know that Mormons who do so feel immense amounts of shame if they're really devout, but I still feel like, maybe no one will notice. I'm just a drop in the giant Mormon bucket. Whereas, if you are letting your family down, the foundations will crack and you know it.
Yeah,
It
so
can't do
I
without your help.
at another episode, we used to actually like our parents. You should check it out. It's a great episode because I go over my great grandfather's like memoirs and everything. And the end of it, he lists everyone he knows who's descended from our family and then points out that there is not a degree of criminality among them. But, they're very excited that they're not criminals. They're honest, hardworking men, which is funny because you see a divergence from this type of culture. But if you look even like the generation before him, when they were doing the anti-Confederates, because they organized a bunch of anti-Confederate factions called the Jayhawks in Texas. And if you even look at the story of how he saved the other Jayhawks who were in the Confederate prison, is that he went to the prison and he gave them all, the guards, all liquor and like got them dancing and partying. And he did a jig that was so transfixing that it was seen as like a Scottish jig that they didn't notice while all the prisoners were being freed. And this
Very
sort of,
Jack Tales. That's an extremely Jack Tales kind of scenario.
yes, it's an
Like, I feel like someone who
extremely
grew up reading the Jack Tales would think that's a viable solution. I'll get them drunk and do a jig. And then-
I'll get them drunk and do a jig and then we'll
Yeah.
free everyone.
I don't think he would have come up with that had he not been raised in that tradition.
No, very few other people would have thought, okay, I see the camp where all my friends are being held. What do I do? Do I go at night or do I, the Pirates of the Caribbean style, walk out with like booze in my hands and be like, 11.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, that's very much like what Bugs Bunny would do, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's very much like, I'm going to be mad. It's very much what you or I would do. We've been talking recently where we applied for the Survival and Flourishing Fund for another grant from them. And we're going to try to fix AI meme layer threads by building sort of one to supersede them within the AI meme layer. Like I argued, we'll build our own Sawgoss to fight their Sawgoss. And of course, a normal AI safety person is going to be like, wait, you can't just build the big evil AI to protect us from the big evil AI. That's an insanely bold thing to do. Like, you should let's just try to limit the other AIs. And it's like, no, you can't do that. You can't chain, Char-Gothicon, because Char-Gothicon is always going to win at the end of the day. Humans aren't meant to beat him.
Yes, you're like, let's just create one first and hope that we can make it more aligned. And probably if they do give you any funding, it will be because they know
They're
that if you
afraid
don't
I
get
just won't
funding,
use safety.
you won't
Yeah.
do any safety protocols. Because it's true. You won't do any safety protocols if
I
you
don't
don't
see
get
the
funding.
point. We're working with short timelines here, people. But then the other, I don't mean this as a threat. It's just like what I see as practical and what I have the money
Well,
to
and also,
implement.
yeah, like we literally don't have the money for it, so we can't do it without the funding. But we're
But
going to do it
also,
anyway.
I mean, if you look at even the way that I have approached pronatalism in media and stuff like this, it has been very Jack Talesy. It has been very, sort of the giant, all the media establishment, just baiting them into like making a fool of themselves and helping further spread the message and further grow the movement. And they fall on their faces and they get back up and they get angrier and they run again and they're tricked again. And I'm just here having a laugh at the whole situation. The entire way that we have worked on this has been very much like you would see in one of these stories, which I think is interesting and shows, how tied to your cultural heritage you are. But also I think where people may underestimate people from sort of these cultural groups because they otherwise look nerdy. They don't see that this is a cultural group that is, one, bred for an extremely high amount of aggression, and two, may feel that, like me, for example, personally, I got in fistfights constantly as a kid.
Coming from this cultural background, I would go so far as to say it feels weird to me when I meet adult males who have never gotten into a fistfight. That seems weirder to me than never having had sex.
And if you look at other people from clan-based cultures, a great example here that people would look at and say, oh, Elon is a nerdy looking guy. Like, look at
Yeah,
how
people make fun of Elon Musk for like jumping up and down on the stage in Butler, Pennsylvania during the Trump campaign. Whereas like there were instances earlier in his career where he would literally duke it out with his brother in like a nondescript Silicon Valley office, to the point where his brother would be hospitalized just over like technical development disagreements, not huge grievances, just like, hey, this is how they hash it out. And
Well, I think
that's
it's because
yeah.
people online are very bad at determining performative, like aggressive cultures
Yeah.
versus like actually aggressive cultures.
Well, and I think they're also like mistaken the Andrew Tate in the Jack Tales is the giant. He's the
Yeah.
one who gets killed.
Well, no, that's also true. By making yourself look overly threatening within these regions, you are planting a target on your back.
Yeah,
There would have
100%.
been a reason to look nerdy and unassuming within these regions, which is why a lot of the famous people that people know from these regions, whether it is myself or it is somebody like JD Vance, look really like what people would clock as nerdy
Mm.
instead of what people would clock as aggressive. And it reminds me of like the song I showed Simone recently, where I was like, oh my God, this character looks like they were drawn to look exactly like the way I used to dress, with the round glasses and the
The
red
best.
vest and the
Yeah.
tie and the black slacks. And he is just as murdery and crazy as, but because I'm an adult, I'm able to suppress my impulses now. Like I don't get in random fights with people anymore or anything like that. And I think that that's what is expected of us as adults. Whereas I think people that were born without these instincts, and you see this with like Andrew Tate, where I've pointed out, like he clearly is from a very low testosterone, like birth environment. If you look at his facial structure, whereas my facial structure would be seen as like an exaggerated testosterone, like developmental environment.
I should clarify here that I actually think, from my perspective, this makes what Andrew Tate has accomplished kind of cooler rather than less cool. It's kind of like Lewis from Beastars, being born a prey species, but attempting to turn yourself into something that looks and acts and lives more like a predator species. The fact that he was born and developed in such an extreme, because he doesn't just look like low testosterone, he looks like an exaggerated example of low testosterone environment, and yet become what he has become, I actually see as one of the cooler aspects about him.
I mean, people don't know to cue for that. They're like, oh, that's also going to affect like their brain and the way that they approach problems.
But it's not just the biological differences that give you a different mental framing of reality. It also the cultural differences.
And this is why I think, you need a degree of cultural diversity, because the ideas that I'm able to come up with for resolving ideas like AI safety are going to be very different than the ideas somebody who is acculturated within like a Jewish or Catholic cultural context is going to come to.
Well, and I also think it highlights this misunderstanding of what traditional masculinity is, looking at masculinity by only a few traditional respects, like this concept of soy face that emerged in like 2017, 2018, like soy boys, like which is really just associated with like looking more expressive or not showing classical masculine traits. Like normally when I see people refer to someone having soy face, it's because they're expressive or they're laughing or they're smiling and they're looking like they have a sort of ironic joke face. And you're not accused of having a soy face or being a soy boy if like you look angry and serious.
Well, no, so this
Um,
actually came from me using AI, because people have said, oh, Malcolm, you look so soy. And I've been very confused by this because like by science, I look like somebody who was overexposed to testosterone. Like that's my facial structure. So I was like, okay, what could they be thinking looks soy about me? And so I actually went to AIs to see if AIs could figure out what would make them think that Malcolm looks soy.
oh
Um,
really?
because
What did AI
glasses
say?
aren't soy. Like there's a lot of people with glasses. A
Yeah.
simple like button-down shirt isn't particularly soy. It's
No,
a very nondescript item.
no.
And so I kept getting AI trying to analyze, and what it eventually came to is I think it's right. It is that I'm not angry, like
Yeah, you
displaying
either have
active
to look
anger.
expressionless or angry, and then you count as masculine. Whereas, like most of the most, I would say, masculinely acting people, at least until they get self conscious, laugh a lot and are very expressive.
The point being here is people are confusing the fact that I am excited for life and happy and laugh a ton with a lack of masculinity, because within the cultures that they are from, that is genuinely seen as a lack of masculinity. But what's interesting is within this culture that has the jack tails, it's like their core structure of what masculinity is. You, that is not a lack of masculinity. That is actually the very height of what you are supposed to be as a man, which is
Yeah.
irreverent and not letting things get to you.
Well,
And
and
I
that's what really gets me about things like testosterone replacement therapy, which you see like people like figures like Jeff Bezos go through, where he has this transformation where suddenly he's like super jacked and he never smiles anymore. Is that a lot of men are turning to testosterone replacement therapy. Like it went 4x among men who were between 18 and 45 from
Yeah.
2003 to 2013. And then there was another 50% increase from 2013 to 2023. And this comes from a place of insecurity, which is inherently feminine. Like if you are on testosterone replacement therapy, you are a preening woman. I mean, now there obviously are like some health conditions where it's like, oh, this is really a problem.
Yeah, but
Um,
I've talked about, this in the past, but it is worth noting that this strategy, you could be like, well, that's a niche cultural marriage strategy. Certainly it doesn't work on like the average woman or young woman. And
Mhm.
I'm like, bro, like young women are not thirsting after like Russell Crowe. They're thirsty after people like Benjamin,
Benedict Cumberbatch, the guy who plays Loki,
the guy who plays the Pirates of the Caribbean guy. What's his name?
yeah, the wrestler, the whistler, what's the Whistler? No, the thing
The
from Dr.
Onceler, you're
Seuss, the
like, oh,
Onceler.
Tumblr sexy boys, like
Yeah,
Onceler, like, yeah.
lanky, pale,
This
expressive.
this is actually a very common, like, ideal profile for a lot of women. But I think men don't recognize it because they've keyed to cultural cues on the internet, and they don't realize that what the ideal man is diversely expressed across cultures.
Yeah,
And they may not be understanding that even within their own culture, because a lot of people have lost touch with like American cultural roots, and
yeah,
they don't know their Jack stories. They don't know this stuff, so they
yeah.
think, oh, masculine isn't the guy who subverts and tricks the more powerful person and then takes their stuff and murders it. You can take out the murder part, but subverts and tricks the more powerful player while having a good time. Masculine, it's the guy who's like gruff the whole time, right? But another fun tradition I found while doing this research, it's called the Charivari. And so when couples get married, to prevent them from like just to mess with them, like trolling is obviously big within this culture.
Yeah.
The wedding guests would all go around their house where like their wedding bed would be and make a lot of loud noises and like shoot guns in the air and like sing and dance to make it really hard for them to have sex without, yeah, like yelling stuff at them. And I think that that's like exactly the trolling you'd expect from
I
this,
wonder if
right?
this has produced like a slight tendency of people who are not turned off by loud noises to be among like Appalachian subgroups. The ones who play really loud music when having sex. Because they couldn't produce offspring.
Yeah, they're like, whatever,
They
get
just-
away, I don't care.
Yeah.
Anyway,
It's
but
crazy.
but very interesting to study because if you're from a different cultural group, this will be weird to you. Like,
Yeah,
to
you'll
a
think it's so. Yeah, and I mean, you get comments like this all the time. People being like, "Oh, Malcolm's this or that," and like, one, I mean, obviously it doesn't get to you because you've changed nothing. Which also, I think it points to your complete lack of insecurity about this. You know that they're wrong and that you're right for you at least, and maybe they're right for them. But it's just this is clearly a point of extreme confusion for a non-trivial portion of your viewers, and so I'm glad that you're bringing it to light.
Yes, there's just a cultural difference in masculine ideals, and
Mhm.
me leaning into my own cultural heritage is I suggest other people to adopt a culture to lean into, or learn more about your culture and lean into what makes them different because it likely co-evolved with your biology. Like
Yeah,
when
yeah,
I hear about all this ultra aggression stuff within this region, I'm like, oh yeah, like that definitely co-evolved with like my background, and it's something that as I grew up, I learned to suppress. But I may not need that. I might not need this like irreverent figure. There may be a reason that this culture also did not lean into stereotypes of aggression for aggression's sake because the people who did all died. I mean, if you're in a culture where, honor killings are really normalized for slights, if you're in a culture where, people sharpen their fingernails so they can gouge out your eyes and where duels happen at the drop of a hat, maybe don't be growly and angry for angry's sake, or you're not going to have a high chance of surviving. But do be do have that within you, but have it within you in a way that they are not going to see or recognize like right off the bat, right? Like it shouldn't. What's the word I'm looking for here? Be seen as like an offense to them or like you think you're better than them. I mean, this
Mhm.
is actually very key to the way I interact with people as well. This like really like happy, upbeat, like, hey, how are you doing? Great to meet you,
Oh,
etc.
yeah.
Which is a way of meeting people and engaging with people, which above all else is based around ensuring that they know that I don't think I'm better than them. Because
Yeah.
that's like the core thing that you need to stay alive or appeal to politically this cultural region.
Yeah. Survival mechanism.
Well, and it's why the Democrats can't, because they do think they're better than them. They're like, well, we're educated and you're a bunch of, racist hillbillies that we just need to learn to code or something like that,
Yeah, and what they're really just doing is painting a giant target on their back. Oh, so you're elite and you think you're better than me. Okay, open season. Thanks for letting me know. Wonderful.
Yeah, wonderful. This is so great.
Yeah, new target.
Love you to death, Simone. Always
Love you
fun
too.
to talk culture.
And you haven't watched it enough time. It's because you are
I hate that movie
insufficiently.
so much.
Come on, man. The Jean-Paul Gaultier. Oh my God.
The science, they're like,
clothing.
it's
Listen,
triple
hard
stranded
sci-fi is
helix.
great. Not all sci-fi has to be hard sci-fi. Give it a rest, Malcolm.
Don't
doesn't
be
have to be
retarded
correct.
sci-fi, okay? Don't be retarded.
It's the best
sci-fi.
depiction of what consumer spaceships as cruise ships are gonna be like, because it's the only depiction. And it introduces so many concepts that I think we really need, like sedation travel. It's unfair that you don't like that movie. It's like, oh, costumes. You have terrible taste.
You have terrible taste, but I'm happy that you're going to learn to make sushi. Like, I have been drooling over that concept all day.
Just what? Tuna sushi?
Well, no. So what we're going to get is some tuna, and we're going to need imitation crab.
Oh, yeah, because real crab.
Well,
is
no,
gross.
imitation crab is what's used in most sushi.
Mhm.
And if you're doing like typical like rolls, right?
What is imitation crab made out of? Is it a fish product or
I
is
think
it
it's a fish product. Actually, I should write a list of all the
non-fish?
things I'm gonna need. We're gonna need wasabi. We're gonna need ginger. We're gonna need
Yeah.
eel sauce. It'd be cool if we could do some eel ones. If you don't want to work with eel, we can just do tuna.
No, I mean, I've eaten a lot of unagi. I don't know how good I would be at preparing it. Probably
we're
fine.
gonna
Just follow the
see.
instructions. What's
So
so hard
far,
about
you've been
that?
great at everything, Simone. It's too hard.
Just follow the instructions. Do what perplexity tells you to, and it's fine. It's so good for recipes. Love perplexity for recipes. Changed everything. That's right. Yeah, keep going, friends. Keep going. This is our adventure. And it got bears. Well, we better be very careful then, right, Octavian?